on nation building, which most of the Indian development sector people and workers have never been engaged with. And I thought this is a good topic to discuss today because in the early period of the 21st century, we are in a scenario where still some of his works done 100 years ago remains quite relevant. So I will start using the PPT, and yeah, so I'll share it first and see how it works. Yeah. Okay, I guess you're all able to see the PPT that I have just shared. If not, you can inform and we'll try to definitely do something about it. I'll go slide by slide. First 5 minutes or so, I will just spend about on the issue of giving you a sense of what Tagore's entire body of works were about. And that includes all the works that he has done in creative arts as well as in other things. I want to skip the second slide because I'll come back to it later on. But let's go to the third slide where one can see essentially a simple table of numbers where one gets a sense of the scale of the body of work in the creative field, from verses to songs to black and white sketches to color paintings to essays to plays to literary criticism, personalities, stories, novels, etc. But that apart, he also built an institution known as Vishwabharati, and of course became famous for 2 national anthems and music score to the 3rd national anthem, which people don't know much, which is the Sri Lankan national anthem. So I'll move to the next one, which gives a sense of Vishwabharati in Tagore's time. And I will quickly put all the bullets here so that you can have a glance at all that existed in 1940-41 when Tagore passed away. Essentially, it had 2 schools, one of which is world famous because while being and doing the school, he got the Nobel Prize. So he became famous as well as the school became famous. But what is also not known is that it also has, at that time, 67 non-formal schools in 59 villages around Shantiniketan, Sriniketan. As a part of the university, it had 7 language literature departments, 4 social science departments, 1 agricultural college, and you have to know that this is the first agricultural college in the country, natural sciences department, fine arts department, music, schools of rural reconstruction. The university also owned 250 rural cooperatives, 1 central cooperative bank, 1 vocational training institute, a marketing cooperative, an university press, and a 12-acre university farm for agriculture. Now, some of it looks familiar because any university should have natural sciences, social sciences, fine arts, music, but a lot of it would look very unfamiliar. And that's the reason, that's also the reason why we should be talking it till today. The parts that are unfamiliar to you, I'm sure, are why there are universities were running so many non-formal schools in those days, in the 40 years of the 20th century. Why the university was owning a central cooperative bank, and this is the 3rd largest central cooperative bank in West Bengal now. Why it had 350 plus rural cooperatives, etc. But my story about his work on nation building, particularly in the villages, and what he named as rural reconstruction, would be mostly around those aspects of it. But I'll start by a simple, firstly, about giving you a sense of the story, and then coming back to it with certain theoretical aspects of ideas, concepts, which still are relevant today. So the journey actually began in 1891, when Tagore was 30 years old, had 2 children already, married. His father wanted him to look at his zamindari in a place called Srilai Daha in Patisar district, which now is in Bangladesh. And they had a large zamindari there in spanning two districts. They also had large zamindari in parts of West Bengal, parts of Odisha, and parts of what is known as Jharkhand today. But Tagore went up and started looking at his father's zamindari. And in that context, he roamed around his boat for nearly a year to see village life. And this is probably the first time he had very direct contact with the village life of United Bengal at that time, which was his zamindari was spread over 5 parganas, which was the name of the sub-district level areas in the Mughal times and British times as well. As a result of his long journey for 1 full year, roaming around in boats, looking at his zamindari and the villages and the people and their lives, he wrote a letter to a set of letters, but one letter was very crucial in what we are going to talk about. And in this letter, I'm quoting a little part of it where he's saying, "We surrender and accept the torture that comes from nature. Equally, we accept the torture from our kings and can't say a word against the torture that is meted out to us by religious scriptures from ages. Such a world deserves only to be fled from. These people are neither of any help to the world, nor they can bring happiness or beauty to it." The point that he's making here is that village life and villagers have three overarching barriers to improve their human conditions. One, of course, was the barrier from nature. Either it was in the form of famine, or it in the form of diseases, or in the form of flood, or in the form of cyclone. That's what he called as the torture from nature. And the second was the torture from the zamindars and the kings, whether they were British or the Mughals, and the taxes that they have to pay to the zamindars as well as the kings, the land tax and canal tax and other things. And of course, the second, third level of barrier was what, in his opinion, was religious scriptures, what people were supposed to be doing. And from there, it definitely arose it struck his mind about the caste system, the separation of religion, people of different religions in Bengal society at that time. So what he identified as the greatest barriers of improving human conditions were these three. And most of its later works will be around these three issues. But when he started, he of course didn't have any understanding of theoretical or conceptual or historical understanding of what needs to be done. So he started doing simply what he thought should be done. And these are some of the things that he started doing. He started experiments in agriculture. He brought new varieties of maize, new varieties of potato, basically trying to do agriculture, improve agricultural productivity, but mostly from the seeds and from the systems and crop management which were available in other parts of the country and already in practice. He also started doing silk because Bengal was already known for its high quality of silk. So he started doing mulberry production. He started the Agricultural Loan Bank in 1905. And that probably was one of the earliest development banks in the country. And at the same time, in his own Zamindari house, he started an handloom training center in the same year. Initiated. Sorry, shall I stop? Initiated a system of panchayats, and the idea of panchayat as a local governance and local arbitration, local dispute resolution mechanisms, all that was part of his work. He started with something called Salishi in Bangla, which was essentially drawn from Armenia, a local arbitration process in which people would appear to settle their disputes locally. One of the most famous things which later got traction all across the Bengal society was this community grain storage against famines. This was named by him as Dharma Gola. Dharma means code of conduct, good conduct. Gola means the grain storage. Started paying schools and all. So these are how, in some way, partly haphazard, partly some thoughts behind essentially improving human conditions against the barriers of nature, against the barriers of the peace and other things together. In the period which followed, he actually elaborated his ideas about Swadeshi. And this is the time when in the whole in the whole country, Swadeshi was gaining traction from the Congress. And this is much before Gandhi's arrival in 1915 to India and taking Swadeshi to a much larger level. But he elaborated his works in a famous writing and a famous book that was published in Bangla called Swadeshi Samaj, and where he actually started talking about some kind of theoretical concepts, and in which he said that the biggest mistake he finds Europe has made is that they have submitted the entire human enterprise in the hands of the state. Essentially, he's alerted people by saying that the people's own initiative, people's own way of resolving their own problems became a back burner, and people depended and trusted the state to take and look after them. This was one. At the same time, the second one was, this also was something of a learning from Europe that he gathered, that the whole emphasis in European industrial development and European development was development of the cities and towns and drawing most of the resources from the villages, and essentially a decay of the villages, people moving from villages to the towns, etc. And he felt that, well, this is a kind of a one-way and unidirectional developmental approach. He started conveying to the Congress, in fact, that we should not be copying this European model by saying that towns, and his lines were like this: towns cannot live happily by simply drawing all resources from the villages. Now, this is so true even today. If you look at uh, the resources that we get from the villages and what we give back from urbanity to villages, there is, in economics, there is a huge asymmetry that is pointed out by economists. If you look at our prices of agricultural commodities, and if you look at our other things that we draw from, whether it is water, whether it is other parts from the villages, this unidirectional developmental approach is still so alive, and he alerted that right at that time, which was early 20th century. His meaning of Swadeshi had different ideas, slightly different than Congress, and we will elaborate this a little bit in the further slide. Essentially, he did not mean Swadeshi to abandon anything foreign. And that's the larger point in which he differed very, very vigorously with Congress. He actually said to make conscious choice of what will help ignite the lamp in our villages, which essentially meant that Swadeshi is a collective action. Swadeshi is a conscious choice. Swadeshi is a means of deliberation to decide what is good for us. And it does not mean that anything that we have to, it comes from either Europe or Japan or America, we have to abandon this. And that was one of the important departures from where he differed in Congress. But at the same time, in 1905, Bengal was partitioned. He became the most vocal protester against Bengal partition. And he led the public protests across Bengal. He traveled into many places in Bengal, participated in the protests. essentially also made a cultural effort to bind the Hindus and Muslims of Bengal, but at the same time initiated his works in rural works. And this is the when he started talking about a phrase called rural reconstruction. And then in 1908, he presents a village reconstruction charter at the Regional Conference of Indian National Congress. And we have to remember this for another reason. This particular charter, as well as this particular Congress, this is for the first time in Indian National Congress that a vernacular language was used in the deliberations of the proceedings of the Congress. And he chaired that particular regional conference, and in that he presented the charter. I want to show you the charter in the next slide, which has 15 points. And I hope you are all able to see this. And I want you to take 2 minutes to read all of them if you have not read yet. And tell me thereafter, when you look at this charter, which is more than 100 years old, in fact, 110 years old now, what do you see and make sense of it when you look at this 1 century later? So I'll stop here for a couple of minutes and would like you to read the charter if you can, I hope you can, and tell me what you feel about it. And this is the charter he presented, and I have to just mention here for record, Congress did not accept the charter. If somebody has read it and have anything to comment or anything to ask, I'm ready to take it. Is someone trying to ask anything?
Hello?
Yes.
So I have a question. I wanted to know what made Congress disagree with the charter.
So firstly, Congress was still a very activist, social movement, political movement oriented. It was not even a party at that time. It was a congregation of movements. What they felt was their task was to do Swadeshi in terms of abandoning foreign goods, trying to raise collective voice of people against the British, demand Swaraj, etc. But they were not ready mentally as well as organizationally to invest in what Tagore would have called model building. To have someone go there and work without the other part and build new models and new alternatives to carve out a space for new India. For Congress, the whole idea was essentially to raise voice, raise opinions, write letters to the governor and to the king and the queen, the parliament, make conferences and etc. Whereas Tagore was saying that if you have to build a new India, what you are doing is important, certainly. I have no issues about it. But at the same time, we have to start to work at local levels to really see how do we see our new India going to be. There was nobody in the Congress at that time who took that as a work, which is the reason. And there were exchanges with Congress leaders at that time when actually people started saying, that Tagore is a romantic. This is not the time to do such things. When we have our Swaraj, when we have our independence, we can do whatever he thought we could do, but this is not the time to do such things. But I want to ask you something, the person who has asked me, is there anything that really strikes you in this charter today?
Hello? Yes,
Yes.
sir. Uh, I have two things that I actually would like to appreciate. The first is about to start using indigenously made goods and products, and the second is to teach science, history, and biographies of great people of the world. That point, because he is also talking about not isolating children from religion, which actually still forms an important part of our lives, but he was actually trying to introduce them to all the different ideologies that exist.
Right. Good. In fact, that's very good. What I would like also to bring to your notice is one point, which was in fact on the right side of it, the third below, the third from the bottom, where he is talking about collecting and analyzing data from each of the villages, and he's giving ideas of what data to be kept. When I looked at this charter about 20 years ago, honestly speaking, I was completely thunderstruck by the idea of a poet, essentially, and a creative person to look at so concretely what data needs to be kept at village level and collected at village level and analyzed, which includes things that we even now do, like migration, rise of crops, rise of diseases, people suffering from various diseases, etc. It's absolutely amazing, looks like. Okay, any other, otherwise I'll proceed.
So we have rather two comments, Ashok. One of them is by Mr. Ravi Srinivasan. It's a comment. He says a very comprehensive, absolutely holistic development, all dimensions included and focused. And then we have another question from Mr. Tom Haslett saying, curious to explore brotherhood among hamlets, villages, and districts.
Sorry, what's the last line in the...
Curious to explore brotherhood among hamlets, villages, and districts.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, his works were mostly in village levels, and so whatever he was talking, it was essentially to institute village level processes. But in later works, he also dealt with certain issues of things to be done at district level as well. Yeah, okay. So I will move now, if there is nothing more, to something else which is not there in this charter.
We have Mr. Suman Srivastava who would like to raise his hand.
Please.
No, go ahead. Sorry, it was by mistake.
Okay, all right, sure.
Okay. So one thing I have to say that whatever is written in this charter, most of it, in fact, except that data collection part probably, most of it was based on nearly 14 years of work on the ground. And these were not ideas coming from anywhere and not worked upon. This is the interesting part. The reason I say this is there is something which is not there in the charter because he hasn't worked on that until then. And that I do in the next slide, which is the slide called Cooperatives. It's interesting that there's nothing of a mention of cooperatives in this charter because the story begins for him in 1906 when his son and son-in-law go to Urbana-Champaign, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, USA to learn agriculture. And this is a time when Indian elites were sending their sons mostly to England, essentially to become either study law or to become civil servant. And that was the stream of Indians, those who were going to study in Cambridge and Oxford and then become Indian civil servant. Whereas this person is sending his son and son-in-law in the same period to USA to learn agriculture. And thereafter, when they were about to finish and come in 1909, he asked them to go to Ireland to learn about cooperatives. He also, in that letter, said that you can go to Denmark, but Denmark is a free country, whereas Ireland is still a colony of the same imperial rule that we are. So how Ireland is doing cooperatives, he wants these two gentlemen to learn. So they returned after 8 months staying there in Ireland and starting to, knowing about how cooperatives are. And in 1909, the first cooperative dairy starts in this particular place where he started his rural work. And in the history of Indian cooperatives, some people claim that this was probably the first cooperative dairy in the country. In fact, first probably the cooperative, but there is now new evidence saying that in Karnataka, in northern part of Karnataka, there was a cooperative which in fact started by some local people, and a dairy in fact in 1906. So in terms of record, this may be the second or the third, but in terms of the history of cooperatives in India, its importance can't be underestimated. In 1910, his son joins his works and the cooperative starts spreading. In 1911, he establishes his first cooperative bank, and this is the first cooperative bank in the country, with 8,000 rupees as corpus, drawn as a loan from the Zamindari treasury. And unfortunately, that loan was never paid back. But what is important is to know that in 1913, when he receives his Nobel Prize money, the money was 1,08,000 rupees, and he put that money into the bank's corpus in this cooperative bank. And the interest, part of the interest was supposed to go to start or run the school that he started in 1901 in Shantiniketan. So, and the cooperatives actually spread. And in 1918, he started first writing on the cooperatives, and there were 4 seminal articles which came as a little book later called the Cooperative Principles. And there he actually expounded first about what his ideas of cooperation and cooperatives are. And as a result of the cooperative part of it, including the cooperative bank, the work in the Pratiswar actually spread over 600 villages, which are on record. The names of those villages are on record. They're all in the Tagore Museum in Shantiniketan, available for public observation. And I'm just quoting a few, for the sake of our time, I need to be a little quick. So there were some quotes from these articles where essentially he found cooperatives not only as a mechanism of production and exchange and trade, but also as a formal moral and operative principles binding humanity. And if we look at the 4 articles of 1918 to 1928, in the first one, he is mostly talking of practical things, how cooperatives work, how they have benefited people, how Denmark has changed the whole country through cooperatives. But as he moves to other 3 articles, he talks about the value that cooperative brings in. And in fact, what is interesting is that he started even dreaming that cooperatives can make enormous amount of change in the world in terms of having to do with how humanity would live together, what are the binding mechanisms, and all that. So what you look at is that in 1908 Charter, there was not a single mention of the cooperatives because he has not worked on that issue at all at that time. And that is what interests me also, that here is a person who, essentially a creative person, supposedly dreaming all the time and thinking of new things in the world. But when he comes on to look at nation building work He has dealt with issues only on the basis of work that was on the ground, done by him and his people on the ground. I will move now to another phase in the rural reconstruction work, which is what we call as Sriniketan. Now, a bit of 2 minutes introduction to Sriniketan is necessary because unlike the place Shantiniketan, which is known globally and in India all the time, this place is largely unknown, which is just about 4 kilometers on the west of Shantiniketan. The land he bought in 1912, essentially to start work on rural reconstruction, couldn't do much until 1916. And when we talk about Vishwabharati, we have to remember that Vishwabharati has two major campuses. One is the Shantiniketan campus, where it's mostly known, and the lesser known campus is Sriniketan, where it also has most of its rural extension, rural construction, reconstruction work gradually getting consolidated over time when he moved permanently to live in 1906. Just a bit of a time thing, which is the school that he started in 1901 was the Shantiniketan School, which is known as one of the alternatives, pioneering alternatives education experiments in the country. But he also started another school, which was even more radical in 1924 in Sriniketan, where it was only meant for rural children. Mostly the teachers also came from those places. And it is interesting that when Gandhiji, he came to meet Tagore for the first time in 1915 when he came back to India. But thereafter he came in 1920 again, and then in 1925, where he was shown essentially the work of the rural school, which was still in Shantiniketan campus, just about to move to Sriniketan. And it was so coincidental, one would say, that he was completely overwhelmed that whatever he wanted to build as a new education model, in his words, it is Naitalim, Tagore seemed to have already been doing it in practice. What happened to him, and this is an interesting story, he went to meet Tagore in the evening and he said that, please give me two of your people from the rural school, and I want to take them to Wardha and start the Naitalim school, which he was planning to do. The story was that Tagore, of course, agreed, but the people could not go there because the main person who was to go, he died in cholera, unfortunately, and that was the person he saw who went to learn agriculture. But later on, somebody actually went there, and he was a Sri Lankan Tamil who was studying in Shantiniketan, and he went there and became the first principal of Gandhian Naitalim school, and he remained principal throughout his life for the next 12 years, where Gandhian Naitalim school spread across Bihar, Odisha, Bengal, and other places. There were a total of 238 Naitalim schools, and he was there. So coming back to Sriniketan, the rural school started in 24. The Rural Education and Extension Center started in 1922. The Vocational Education Center, 1929. The College of Agriculture started in 1927. A central cooperative bank established in 1927. And this is a very, very successful bank, still very alive and very much working. It's the third largest cooperative bank in Bengal now, West Bengal. The Rural Market Sales Shop and Rural Products in 1937. And there, he started again the same kind of work with much more organized support system from the university, which formed in 1921. And here we could find the cooperatives actually spread, non-formal education spreads, and many other works actually spreads. In 1938, there was a university dairy. And in 1926, it started having the detailed village survey on 38 parameters. When people talk about detailed village survey, even today people refer to Kumarappa's work, who was Gandhi's disciple in the 1940s, and very few people know that it was in 26 that 2 villages were studied, and thereafter each and every village where Vishwabharati worked, there were data getting collected, and this continued until university became a central university in 1951 without any disruption. And that entire data set, entire data things are still there, and people have used it earlier, but nowadays people do not use it anyway at all, because largely this has got forgotten. And one interesting thing we need to remember is that he was also one of the pioneers in a cooperative insurance company, which was a very successful insurance company called Hindustan Cooperative Insurance Company. So when the insurance in business was nationalized in 1956 and LIC was formed, and Tagore was the lifetime chairperson of this insurance company until he died in 41. This was taken over by LIC and merged into LIC. So in his sense, the cooperatives actually spread from production to insurance to banks to education cooperatives to health cooperatives. Out of these many cooperatives, that the health cooperatives still are visible and one can go and see them working even after 60 or 70 years of work. But I don't have much time to go into those details. These are some works from these photographs from Shantiniketan, Sriniketan, where the first on the right, on the left, on the upper side, is part of the rural school where they're learning woodwork. These are women learning what we call batik. We brought it from Indonesia actually. And the lower one, they are actually learning to do bookbinding, as well as there was a little bit of work on lac. I now go to how do we see all this work together? And when I try to look at this, I see a host of very radical, interesting experiments of what he called nation building and rural reconstruction, which were actually work on the ground. And these are the things that I listed on the right, and I'm just putting them, that's it. So right from the Panchayati Raj system of local arbitration to agricultural credit, to grain storage, to rural schools, to cooperatives, to women's education, technical support institution, the whole Sriniketan campus, which is in around 2,000 acre land campus now, even now, it was about a technical support set of institutions to build human conditions in the villages. Documentation, an idea of university rooted in social change. I mean, this was an interesting university experiment where, on the one hand, people were doing fine arts and architecture and sculpture and literature, and there were many experiments and many radical experiments even in the university at that time. For example, in 1928, the university established, after he visited China, the university established a Chinese language literature department, and the first in the country, and still the first. There is only one more, which was established by the alumni of this particular center in JNU, and these are the only 2 Chinese studies department in the country academically. Similarly, there was a university established Japanese studies, university established Russian studies, and there was also very interesting experiments on education, educational training, etc. I don't want to spend on various interesting things that happened, but one of the things I would like to mention is that there was a very large and conscious and continued effort by the university to popularize science, social sciences, agriculture, water resources. There were 2 series of popular books which were available in those times in 50 naya paisa or 25 naya paisa type. Nowadays, again, the university is bringing up those collections. One is called Vishwavidya Sangraha and the other is called Lokshikha Granthamala, where the university published more than 200 titles where ideas and concepts of natural sciences, history, social sciences were made to publish in very simple words for ordinary people. And this is an experiment where no other university has been able to do this once it became. And in fact, the university itself discontinued this after it became a central university in 1951. For the sake of time, I will go into essentially my two last. One thing I may mention is that there was a first village women of 500 plus village women had their conference in Vishwavarti. These village women were working mostly on various livelihood initiatives as a part of the cooperatives and as a part of the rural reconstruction work. And this was the first time, in fact, Tagore chaired their conference and wrote a charter of demands to the government and to the district collector, which then they walked to the district town, which was 22 kilometers on the north, which is called a Suri, a small town where the district administration sits at that time. Even now, it's there. And then plus those charter of demands. So very, very interesting experiments happened. I now go to my last but one slide where I want to really capture 5 or 6 large theory of change, if I have to say this in a modern developmental language. One is definitely an experiment on education. And this is Tagore's rejection of British education is very well known. His radical experiments in Shantiniketan and Sriniketan are known. Fundamental point in the Tagore's educational idea and the rooted in local and very much in harmony with nature. And that is where he brought the idea of living in harmony with nature as a part of educational curriculum, much before it became fashionable these days to talk about sustainability. But at the same time, it was all global. They were all reading literature from other parts of the country. They were all reading literature and history of the world. They were all reading religion of different types. So it's a very interesting kind of a mix of the local, the natural, and the global in a very creative combination. And he felt that if we have to build a nation of a different kind, education is one thing that we have to work for life. The second, of course, was Swadeshi, which was well known, the balance between towns and villages, the focus on self-reliance, not to surrender to the state or the market, harmonious with nature and with others. That was very, very much part of his agenda all the time, but that was very different from what Congress understood and even Gandhi understood as Swadeshi. Then, of course, the idea of cooperation and cooperative. Cooperation as a binding principle. Cooperatives as institutions of production, exchange, and service, all three. He coined a term which no longer one finds in developmental literature in India. It's called Atma Shakti, which is essentially called faith in collective action and human creativity. Fundamentally, it spoke about that today, in today's world, we call it a different way, slightly different way called human agency. But human agency is mostly in the Western literature is about individuals. But here the focus was more in collective action. And human agency essentially focuses on the political and the social. But Atma Shakti also talked a lot about human creativity. And in the later part of his life, he wrote a very famous essay called Religion of Man, which was an essay he delivered in Oxford. And here he actually talked about two lives in humanity. One is the life of a laborer, where one makes a living, and the other is the life to live meaningfully. And this is the distinction he made from the religion of God to the religion of man. And it's a very, very a profound article, other than the another profound article which he wrote on the last birthday of his, called The Crisis in Civilization. This is another very profound philosophical and theoretical article for future of humanity, where we have to decide how humanity lives together as meaningfully. And of course, the whole experience of Vishwa Bharati, a rooted institution of higher learning, rooted in the local and the natural, and also is an institution committed to social change. Before I go to my last slide, which is a poem which everyone knows, I want to go back to the second slide of the PPT, which I said in the beginning that please skip it because I want to come back. And I want you to read this for 2 minutes or 1 minute. It doesn't take much time to read. It's a quote, it's from a famous book that he contains his lecture in Japan. Sorry, yeah. So this is there are grave questions, and this is probably summarizes his entire concern about humanity, and therefore the work that he has tried to do. There are grave questions that the Western civilization has presented before the world, but not completely answered. The conflict between the individual and the state, the labor and capital, the man and the woman, the conflict between greed of material gain and the spiritual life of man, the organized selfishness of nation, which today people call it nationalism, and the higher ideals of humanity, the conflict between ugly complexities inseparable from giant organizations of commerce and state, and the natural instincts of man crying for simplicity, happiness, beauty, and fullness of leisure. All these have to be brought to a harmony in a manner not yet dreamt of. In today's context, 100 years later and more, this was 1916, so today is in fact 102 years later. This is as much relevant, profound, and as much important as it was at that time when he was alerting and warning Japan that if they follow the West, they would have to have these questions answered, which the Western civilization has not yet answered. And if I have to interpret his entire body of work on nation building as well as reconstruction of the villages, what he named, essentially to look at human beings and how human beings would live individually and as community and happily. There are these contradictions that needs to be addressed in some way. And his entire effort was essentially that. If you look at the the last slide, which is the famous poem, I don't want to spend time on this. I just want you to look at that. But I would leave with you the only one question on this. We have all read this poem in our schools, and may also sometimes even later. But today I would like you to look at this as a development professional. When you see this poem, what are the developmental questions that comes to your mind? We'll not discuss this, but I will leave with you this question that, this poem can be read in many, many ways. One of the ways it can be read is also, what are the profound questions of humanity and future that brings us through this, he brought us through this poem. And in sometimes when we look at many of the later theories, much, much later theories, either development, freedom, or etc., other things, you see the glimpse of those many ways in this poem. So I'll stop here with just 10 minutes left for our scheduled time, but if we have any scope of further discussion, I'm happy to do it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Sircar, for being there today. And I think it was a great webinar, and I'm sure all the participants really enjoyed it. We have two questions that our participants have actually sent us. So it'd be great if you could answer those questions. I'm sure these questions are so universal in nature that it would answer a lot of questions for others who've been thinking about it. So the first question is by Mr. Shakti Saran, and the question is, did Tagore's creativity and artistic talent help provide the clarity for his social sector reforms? Would it have been a different story if he wasn't a poet?
That's a very good question, and in fact, a tricky question to answer. I would say that the identity of a poet or a musician or a person of creative arts essentially is known as the person's ability to imagine what is not there and create things of beauty, things of great pieces of one would call beauty in that sense, whether it is poetry or music or anything else. I think that element of imagination was fundamental in Tagore's ideas of building a new humanity. But I would also have a little caution in the sense that the way Tagore reasoned and believed in human reasoning and his very famous exchanges with Gandhi on the importance of reasoning and not on the importance of fate and destiny and other things, was it also a testimony to that? I'm not sure that comes from essentially a creative human mind. I think Tagore was the unique person in India who were able to combine highest forms of creativity and at the same time never lost the importance of human reasoning and material reasoning as a core value when he talked about building nations. I think that's the part. What helped him as a poet was definitely the scope that he traveled all across the world. It's very interesting that this is a person who traveled not only to Europe, he traveled through Asia, he traveled to Latin America. He was a person, probably the first Indian to go to Argentina, stayed there for 25 days in a person's house. He went to South Africa, he went to China, he went to Iran, he went to Indonesia. I mean, those are the places no Indian would go in the early part of 20th century, other than the laborers, other than the slave laborers. I think this scope of creating, and wherever he got something, he received something, he brought it. That is how he brought various dance forms from Indonesia, batik from Indonesia. He brought from even the language of Esperanto, he was brought by him from Sweden. So wherever he got something that he thought would be useful for the nation, he brought it to Shantiniketan. And I actually wrote a book in Bangla about the history of the two schools, where I tried to show what he has been able to bring. So this unity of I think the element of the poet about being the global and the universal, and probably helped him to know the world, and the world is, and he is in fact the first Indian internationalist in that sense. Nehru probably was the second, where he believed in an international humanity and never believed in nationalism at all. So in some sense, it was a combination of the creative mind as well as the mind of reasoning. Both worked together. I think that would be my attempt to answer.
Thank you for the answer. So we have another question, and the question is, was the outgrowth of the rural programs driven by entrepreneurial energy, or was the model driven by institutions that Tagore launched? How does this intersect with the bottoms-up nature of the self-reliance elements of the charter that you had shared with us?
Definitely part of it was entrepreneurial. He never had any misgivings about businesses, small businesses, medium-sized businesses. He always felt that businesses can do good for humanity. But at the same time, he was against very large-scale kind of corporatist business models. Most of his works were bottom-up. Most of his works were through trial and error, through doing and learning and by mistakes. And he has multiple letters, hundreds of letters telling others, telling the relatives that what is the mistake he is making and he's learning. And here is a person who was just like Gandhi also. He was a person who was so open in admitting his mistakes all the time. So it was mostly by trial and error, mostly driven by certain entrepreneurial energy, but also driven by certain core ideas of humanity, which are important to my mind even today and for the future. One is definitely a different model of education, a different model of institutional setting where people can come together and work, a different model of architecture of rural governance. And I have to also inform the audience that when the community development block idea came in 1956, part of it was driven definitely by Ford Foundation, and part of it was an American model. But these people from Nehru's cabinet also traveled across the country to find whether there are existing Indian works going on. And they were surprised that the Srinikatan had almost everything of a community development model, although with some very important differences that already existed. So in some sense, I think it was a part of bottom-up entrepreneurial and definitely a faith in human collective action and not a complete faith in the state and the market powers that be. If one reads his 3 or 4 pieces on nationalism, one would understand in 1916 he was warning what a danger this would be. He was in fact predicting the First World War as well as the Second World War in some sense. And at the last piece that he wrote in 1941, he actually also said that whatever I tried to say at that time comes out to be more true today about when state become nationalist, what it has happened. So his faith in collective action of humanity always remained intact. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor Sircar. I'm sure this was a very enriching experience for all our participants. And we'd really like to thank you for having the webinar and then answering the questions that you raised. I would also like to thank everyone who joined this webinar, and would also request everyone to keep watching this space as we have many more such interesting webinars lined up. So do keep tuned in. Thank you so much for joining. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks all for listening. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.